Thank you. I'm not quite sure what to do with all the Gamecock Tar Heel jokes, so I'm just going to leave those for today and come back during basketball season and we'll have another round or something. So I am delighted to be here. Thank you, Dean Bruce and Dr. Woodard. I'm happy to have this great panel here today to have a conversation about opportunity zones. I talked to a number of you in the audience before today and found out that there's just a wealth of knowledge already in the room. So I do want to say on the onset that this is like an initial conversation. As many of you probably know, the governor and Senator Scott are having a program January 25th that'll get more into some details. We're waiting for some regulations to be written on the program. But with the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, we're really delighted to have this collaboration with the university. And our plan would be to come back and do some more extensive workshops as we learn more about the program and learn more about how we can work some of the different models with you. So you can expect for us to be back if the dean will allow me to pester him by email and come back again. The community development function at the Federal Reserve is probably the lesser known function. You all are familiar with FOMC and interest rates, but across the 12 reserve banks and the Board of Governors, we have this function called community development, and South Carolina is in the 5th District. So we spend a great deal of time working with the financial institutions, working with community groups and local governments all across the state. As you know, the Federal Reserve, our mission is a strong economy and a sound financial system. My colleagues are no different. We're just very interested in making sure that the people up the chain with the Federal Reserve know about the community perspectives. So we spend a great deal of time listening in the community and relaying information back up so that what's going on in all of the South Carolina communities gets communicated up to the FOMC. And so it's with that mission today that I want to focus a little bit about opportunity zones. And what I'm going to do is a little bit of background, and then we have a great panel of leadership in South Carolina, and let them offer a little bit of their perspectives on this. So I'm going to start with, this is your state opportunity zone website that Department of Commerce and your governor's office put together that shows the zones in your state. And they did this along with all of the other governors earlier this year designated the zones. And I'll tell you a little bit about the zones in South Carolina. So opportunity zones passed in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017. And these are low-income census tracts. So in my role with the Federal Reserve, community development focuses on low and moderate income communities as well as underserved. So there's definitely an overlay with what we focus on. This particular law said that a state can designate up to 25% of its low-income tracts as these zones. And I've got a link in here. I think the university will post this website. You can go to a link. This is a link for the whole country on mapping, and you can zoom in and take a look at any of the zones across the country. So South Carolina has 1,097 census tracts, 538 were eligible as low income, and you have 128 approved tracts. There is one in each of the 46 counties in South Carolina. Now, to step back a little bit, the policy goals, this concept is not exactly new. It's been around. There was some legislation introduced in 2015, and it ended up being rolled into the tax bill last December. But really the policy goals here are to drive long-term private sector investments in these communities, channel equity capital into overlooked markets. So as the country has been growing, we see some unevenness across the country with growth, and so this was specifically designed for those overlooked markets. Reinvest realized capital gains into distressed communities, and this is the first new community investment program in more than 15 years. Many of you would think about New Markets Tax Credit Program was the last one. There have been other zones. There have been empowerment zones and promise zones that usually come packaged with grants and priorities on federal monies. This is different because this is a private investment tool, so much more like the new markets tax credit. And some of the predictions are that this could scale to the largest economic development program in the country. And I'm going to remind myself and everyone that everything I say today is my view and not that of the Federal Reserve, so that I won't get in trouble anywhere. Some of the benefits of this incentive is that taxpayers can get capital gains tax deferral for investing in these opportunity funds. And the funds are set up, and then they will invest in the zones. And we can talk about that a little bit, and that is also being addressed in the regs. But it's capital gains deferral, it's partial forgiveness, and it's forgiveness of additional gains. So kind of a three-pronged approach to an incentive to a taxpayer. The opportunity funds invest then in the property in those zones. Now, a lot of people that I talked to before the program started said, where are we going to find the list of all of these funds? And I have to tell you, that is not in the law. There is nothing in the law that talks about measuring the effects of this, and there's nothing in the law that talks about a central repository for those funds. So that is really the crux of why we're here today. The goal was to bring interested people in South Carolina together in hopes that as funds are developed among many of you in this room and others, that we'll be able to have a listing in South Carolina so we can match the funds with the census tracts that are eligible. There's one place that you can go now, and this is not an endorsement, but Novogradac, I'll have it on the last slide. You can go to their website, and they have been tracking who is setting up funds. So that is a place where you can go take a look. They make no claims as to the validity of those funds, but they are starting to map those that are out there. The qualified opportunity funds are really an investment vehicle that many of you are familiar with. It can be a corporation, it can be a partnership, and they're going to exist to invest in these funds. What we know right now is that they must hold at least 90% of their assets in those properties, in those zones, and that entities will self-certify. There's an IRS form 8996. I've got a little picture of it. It's still in draft form, but you can go to the IRS and take a look at that. That is the self-certification, and that's really why we won't have a central place for all the funds, because it's really between those entities that create it and the IRS. As far as investment types, what this program does is it looks at commercial real estate development and renovation. It looks at new business, expansion of existing business into the zones, and large expansion of businesses already in the opportunity zone. So you've got the business side and you've got the real estate side of it. And when we start to think about it, there's going to be a lot of meetings coming up because we've got a lot of different business models, and then we've got all these other tax incentives. And what we do know is that opportunity zones can work with those others. The new markets tax credit is a good match, and this was modeled after those. LIHTC is another possibility. In South Carolina, you have an abandoned building tax credit. So all of these tools, there's actually a working group that is sitting and thinking about business models and how some of these tax incentives can interact with each other. So there's going to be a lot more to come on this particular topic. And since I'm with the Federal Reserve, I would be remiss if I didn't say a few words about some of the things that we and others are keeping an eye out for. In terms, there can be positive and negative impacts to the low and moderate income communities. And that's one of the reasons why in several of our states we thought it would be great to bring investors together and then work with them and then introduce them to the zones within their state. Because if you're investing within your own state, you certainly want a return, but you're also interested in how your state fares. So some of the things that we're looking at is you can have this massive influx in capital into those areas on the map I showed you, and these great incentives for taxpayers, but there are very few guardrails. So we have some regs that are going to come out, and we have no metric keeping. So this is really going to be between private sector investors and then those communities as to how this works out. So I would have to say there's a little bit of concern about the fact that there aren't some tighter rules in there. Gentrification is one of those areas. If a community suddenly gets an influx of capital, is that going to displace people in that census tract? And they'll have to move. So instead of addressing uneven growth, you start to move people around, which is really not the intent of this program. So another concern. Under the Community Reinvestment Act, we already worry about hotspots and deserts. So you get boom activity in Los Angeles and New York and Charlotte and other places, and then you have very little activity, especially in rural areas. So this could certainly make that situation worse, where you continue to have hotspots along your coast. Actually, the graph that Joey had up there, you could have those hotspots continue to do well, and then those other areas not. Also, the concentration in high-cost cities is a concern, and probably overwhelmingly concerns about harmful investments in communities. So I think the Municipal Association is in the room. I know I wanted a mayor here to speak to this, but really matching what a community wants and the plans a community already has in place with what investors want as far as a return and some of those tax incentives, and how to marry those two. That's really going to be up to us to figure out as we meet and talk about this as to how to mitigate some of those risks. And then last, I would just say, local communities, there are concerns as far as will this displace other funds. So you might have areas where you have a foundation that's heavily invested. You may have a community development financial institution that's already making a lot of investment in a community. You may even have a bank under CRA that's made investment. Will this private investment displace that or supersede it? So I think we have a number of areas we have to figure out about how some of those investments work with each other, and how to pair the opportunity zone funds with other impact investing. That's a big issue that's taken storm. There's a lot of foundations like the Calvert funds that are looking at kind of mass impact investing in communities. So how we can package some of that, and then how local communities can create appropriate zoning and ordinances that will accommodate some of this investment. As I mentioned, there is one frequently asked question out there on the IRS website. Here's the question: how does a taxpayer become certified as a fund? And then there's the answer, and I showed you the draft form that's there, so that's all we've got under Q&A. And then we have some draft regulations. So those are in U.S. Treasury, where they issued some requests for information in late November. And when I last looked, there were about 30 questions out there, a lot of it about buildings, a lot about accounting treatment. And so we're expecting some more comments to go in, and then we would see Treasury publish some final regulations. And so I've put together a couple of places that I think are good places for you to keep up with the technical aspects of this. The Urban Institute has a SCORE data set where they're looking at communities and what's going in there. That's a great place to keep up with it. The Council of Development Finance Agencies, which will be here in January, has an Opportunity Zones page that they're updating. I mentioned Novogradac has the list of the funds on their page, and then the Federal Reserve has done a webinar, and we plan to keep some updates on our pages as well. And with that, I'm going to pause and let our panel, which I don't think needs a lot of introduction. We have the State Treasurer here, Curtis Loftus, who's been very interested in this. His office has a lot to do with savings plans for individuals, and he's your state's banker, so I'm happy to have him here. Former Governor Hodges, just from his perspective in the past as being the governor of the state with public-private partnerships, and then Mayor Benjamin, who I know his office is already doing a lot on the opportunity zones in Columbia. So what I want to do is let them speak to you about their perspectives, And then I know we'll be back at the end and can take questions on this as well. Thank you.
Well, I thought I was the only politician on the stage. So I'll have to make a quick few changes here. I spent the morning unexpectedly with plumbers and contractors. So I can't tell you how happy I am to be here, and you have good reason to believe it. No matter what I do here, it's going to be a whole lot less expensive than what they're doing there. I want to thank the school, the Dollar Moore School, my neighbor Peter, and Janine, all the great work y'all have done, and all the sponsors. Peter and I share a neighborhood. I'm in the part of the neighborhood that causes it to be in an enterprise zone, and he's in the part of the neighborhood that should take us out of that, but not quite. So we find ourselves in a rural part of the county, but we're only 2 miles from right here in a very large enterprise zone. So that's kind of exciting. As the state treasurer, I manage and invest about $45 billion of your money, about $5 billion of debt. So we try to keep our fingers, on the pulse of what happens. I get invited to a lot of conferences, as you might imagine, and I see a lot of economists. I'm glad to see these two here, well thought of. But I do have to say that every time I'm invited, I think about the John Kenneth Galbraith quote, which I'm sure you guys know by heart. And it goes something along, the only function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable. He spent 50 years at Harvard, and that's what he came up with. I was fortunate enough to have met him once in Switzerland, so it was a real honor. I'm pleased to be here for a couple of reasons. One, I'm a businessman at heart, and I want to encourage the private investment. This is a wonderful tool, and I think that we're fortunate to be right here in South Carolina, where it's a great place to use it. I think that this is a group of people who have decided not to be bystanders. I look out and see my friends who are government officials and economic development partners. I see private investors, I see academics, I see our economists and others here. Y'all have decided not to be bystanders. You're innovators. You're going to participate in this. And that's what makes it so important to me. Again, every day as I sit in my office, I think about government and all the money and all the opportunities we have from a business perspective. Sometimes it's extremely frustrating, I'll tell you. But in other times, it's wonderful. I wanted to talk a few minutes today, thinking I was the only politician here, fellas, about the impetus to do this. We all know Tim Scott. I think that many people in this room would consider his economic policies that we think are right-headed. We think they're the future. I think a lot of us would consider him to be a friend not just to South Carolina, but maybe even a personal friend. I think a lot of us in that old-fashioned Southern Protestant way, and I think you know what I'm saying here, consider him a brother. Tim has been very upfront about how he was raised. He was raised by a single mother who spent 16 hours a day, hour after hour after hour, every day to raise Tim and to make him the man that he is now. I think as a United States Senator, and I visited him there many times, but especially during this time when he was co-authoring and sponsoring this legislation, I think oftentimes, what was he thinking? What did it mean to him? I mean, he's taken a lot of ideas that have been around and some new ones and put them in a bill. No one thought they were going to pass, and lo and behold, they did. What was he thinking? And I know from talking to Tim enough, I never asked him the question exactly on point because I was a little bit afraid to always ask questions like that. But I think he was thinking about what he learned as a child. I think he was thinking about what he learned from his mother. I think he was thinking about the passage in the Bible from Matthew. It's truly, just as you did it for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it for me. And I think about Tim, and I know when he was thinking about rural parts of this state that we've all been to, and we know how they've been discarded, they've been marginalized, and they've been forgotten. We know that their life is not getting better, it's getting worse. And no matter what we do, we have a hard time, a difficult time as investors and as members of the government that supposedly represents them. We have a hard time making that connection and turning the corner. This is how we help the least of these. This is how we go to these counties, or the least of these counties, and we can productively invest our money and our time and receive rewards in the financial system at the same time that we're being true to Tim's thoughts about the least of these brothers and sisters of mine. Not far from here, you can go to places that, and many states have these problems. Go to places that time has forgotten. But you are not bystanders. You're here. You're the innovators. I've mentioned this before. You're the people on the field of play. And my point coming today is, no, you've got an ally here. Of course, the biggest ally for boosting state governments and investment from state government is Henry McMaster, and before him, Nikki Haley. We've got Steve Benjamin, who's done a wonderful job, and the governor here, who I work with on a regular basis on a variety of issues. But we can't do it without y'all. And I've just determined, I've thought about this a lot. This morning, as I heard the expensive saws and drilling going on and the plumbers going out there, and they're thinking about the next beach house they're going to buy at my expense, I was thinking about y'all, because people like Jim Morris and others are the key to this program, and we're going to be here for you. You're going to get a lot of hardcore answers to your questions soon, but this is going to be a lot of regulations that are written. I'm going to be going back and forth to see Tim, and he'll be here in the next few weeks to talk to him about this as well. But I want you to think about that from it. I know you won't get this kind of pitch from anybody else. This is our opportunity. It was written for us in South Carolina. We are a unique set of people. We have been here a long time. We have our problems and we have our path forward. It's our time, and let's take it and let's do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Curtis Loftus, who is a great friend, and we have worked on a number of projects together. Mayor Benjamin, who served with me, gosh, back in 1999, Steve, it's hard to believe. I've been incredibly proud of what he has been able to do, both as Mayor of Columbia and head of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And let me just say to Doug Woodward and Joey Von Nessen, this is the one day you two guys are the coolest kids in class. This is your annual day. I mean, people want to get selfies made with you. Doug, has that ever happened to you before? All right. Yeah, occasionally. It really is an amazing thing that Pete, that you and Joey and Doug and the team have done at USC over the years. They've taken when I first started coming to the annual conference was a smaller crowd, and it has indeed become the economic event in South Carolina every year. And you all have done a remarkable job. I will tell you that in government, we often used the annual report card that you had to sort of measure where we were and look at what the future looked like in South Carolina. And I think it is one of those must-attend events for business leaders across the state. So thank you for what you've done. This, Jenny, is a point where I am supposed to say that if I say something really smart and insightful, it belongs to McGuire Woods Law Firm, of which I'm a member. If I say something stupid, it all belongs to Jim Hodges. And so I will try to make McGuire Woods proud today and talk about a few things that I think are important. Let me just say that this concept of enterprise zones, economic opportunity zones, whatever phraseology we want to use, is certainly not something new. You all have seen this utilized in the past. When I heard it described by Jenny, I thought about a little bit about tax increment financing and other methods we've used in South Carolina and other states to try to accelerate development in areas that otherwise would not have development occur. We are always scratching our heads for ways in which we can help propel growth and development in areas where that's not occurred. The hard part has always been, and I date back to seeing Joey's numbers earlier, I date back to the late 90s when unemployment was incredibly low. And the challenge we had with business leaders was, how do you propel growth and development without straining what is already a very strained labor force? When you have what we have now, a 3% or so unemployment rate, it's really difficult to try to bring new projects into a state, into areas where you already have high employment, because it obviously strains the labor supply, it pushes wages up, a lot of things that businesses were prone to complain about, Mr. Mayor and Mr. Treasurer, to public officials. Well, we all know the way you do that is you try to provide growth and development in areas that perhaps have not enjoyed that same benefit that other areas in the state have. Places that are a little bit unlike the Charlotte area that we talked about, Columbia, Greenville, Spartanburg, Charleston, those areas. And I've got to tell you, as a policymaker, that those were and they remain the toughest areas to deal with. We've got a whole range of issues in these areas, everything from a legacy of poverty to educational challenges. But one of the big challenges we always faced, and I think we continue to face, is a lack of capital to put into those areas. When people have good ideas and you have a cooperative community that is anxious, the problem often was, where do we come up with the investment to be able to do some of these things that are really special? And Jeannie, that's what I particularly like about this whole program, because government becomes a public partner with private enterprise to try to do things that are entirely about generating economic opportunity in communities. And we aren't necessarily doing it in places that don't necessarily need the help. We are doing it in places where otherwise economic growth and development either would not occur or would occur a decade or 2 decades later. This is a chance, I believe, particularly in areas that are sort of, Mr. Mayor, I think of areas like North Columbia, the northern side of Columbia, and I think of areas that are sort of on the fringe of urban growth, where we can jump over what is naturally happening and move into more rural communities with higher legacies of unemployment, or urban communities that have high levels of unemployment and minimal investment. We can move into those areas and actually propel growth forward in a way that is really good for the state. I'm anxious, like the Treasurer and the Mayor, to see the final product from this. I'm most interested in seeing what I think is the incredible creativity of the South Carolina business community, and taking a look at this model and finding ways to invest in communities and working with state officials like the Treasurer and local officials like the Mayor to move our state ahead. Thank you.
Panel, I thought we were going to sit there and just chit-chat with you guys, but since the Treasurer got up and had to get fancy, I'll get up and get fancy and talk as well. I want to thank Curtis for his friendship, and appreciate the Governor's grace in saying that we worked together 20 years ago. I worked for Jim Hodges. He was kind enough to hire me to serve as a member of his cabinet, and it was a wonderful opportunity. Thank him for investing in a young man at that time. I do believe that this new legislation presents some significant and incredible. One test, I'm going to do this one day with someone. I want someone to talk about opportunity zones and not use the word opportunity when you talk about them. I think it's almost impossible. But I think it does present a wonderful opportunity for the people of this great country. The Treasurer mentioned it, and Ms. Milliken Bonds also did too. It's so important to note that in this era in which we live, in which there is not enough pragmatic, bipartisan leadership, to recognize that the origins of this legislation began with Senator Scott partnering with Senator Cory Booker, the Republican representative from Ohio, Pat Tiberi, and Ron Kine from Wisconsin, the Democrat. Bipartisan legislation advanced by Senator Scott. Every meeting I had with him over the last several years, he would bring up his Investing in Opportunity Act. It was something he worked on closely with Steve Glickman and John Lettieri from EIG. John, of course, is a Spartanburg, South Carolina native, and it was Senator Scott's issue. It was what he thought was a significant answer to some of the challenges facing our communities. And when the opportunity presented itself during the debates around the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, he didn't hesitate. He saw a window and he jumped through it. So I think it's so important to give Senator Scott the credit for not only leading in a bipartisan fashion, but seeing an opportunity, really jumping through that window when it presented itself. So I want to make sure I give him a significant nod. We spent a lot of time over the last several months, over the last year, indeed, working with cities across the country, working with investors, working with philanthropic institutions, everyone trying to figure out exactly what's going to happen with opportunity zones. We have across this region about 12 census tracts that have been identified. Our governor was one of the first governors who caught the first deadline. He didn't ask for an extension. He engaged with all of us on the local level, and we were able to identify some of our priority tracts that we thought were just needing that extra push. The extra push that we thought opportunity zone designation could potentially provide for us. We spent a lot of time with some of our philanthropic organizations across the country that see real opportunities in this space, like the Rockefeller Foundation, Bloomberg, Kresge, and others, with several of our academic institutions. There's some exciting work happening at Drexel, where Bruce Katz, some of you may know Bruce, the author of Metropolitan Revolution, and the late Jeremy Novak are doing great work. Some incredible work coming out of Northeastern University that I think would be important to pay attention to around the issue of resilience and seeing the increasing number of significant wet weather events, these storms, and the gap it's leaving and potentially funding how we rebuild infrastructure and how this can step into that space. Secretary Mnuchin, we met with him in the earlier part of September as the regulations, the first regulations were being drafted. They were issued last month. As many of you know, we're in a comment period through the end of this month. Expressed then, and he has, I think, spoken a couple of times that he expects maybe $100 billion, $200 billion we spent in this space. I am a believer that if we get this right, it will be significantly north of that. We know that the potential is for trillions of dollars of deferred or avoided gains to be spent here, and we believe that that is a real opportunity here. I do believe that as Raj Shah, the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, states that investable projects exist at the intersection of market traction and social needs. Unlike enterprise zones or empowerment zones or renewal communities, there aren't 40 opportunity zones around the country. There are over 8,700 of them. Over 8,700 of them that span urban areas, suburban areas, and rural areas all across this country. There's barely a part of America that's not touched by opportunity zones. So that means, of course, there's a significant opportunity to do a number of different things. It also means that there's also significant political peril, that we see the opportunity to get some things done here, but if we don't move, and particularly in the world in which we live in right now, where the political pendulum swings back and forth pretty quickly, if we aren't able to show from the very beginning that the concerns that Senator Scott has raised in every meeting I've had with him, that the concerns that Secretary Mnuchin has raised when we met with him, that all of our mayors have met, that we cannot just create another incentive for tax shelters. We cannot just make developers and syndicators wealthier. We have to make sure that we're affecting people on the ground, that we're deploying effective, comprehensive community development strategies that make sure that people who live in these census tracts also benefit from these investments. That's so important. I know there are a number of CDFI folks, and Mr. Mazik, raise your hand so people know who you are, Bernie, and several others in the room. If you've not engaged with your community development financial institutions in your community, I would encourage you to do so. We spent time just this past week with some of the largest investors in the infrastructure space and P3 space, like Macquarie, probably got a $500 billion under management. Large operators like J.P. Morgan Chase and other smaller but significant folks also in the infrastructure space. I think Meridian has about $60 billion under management. Just trying to find where the sweet spots might be that might allow us to direct investment into these zones that may also benefit, again, the entire body politic, all of our citizens. Infrastructure, we believe, is one of those spaces where there's significant opportunity across America. Depending on where you are and who you talk to, there's at least somewhere between a $1 trillion and $4 trillion need across this country. The American Society of Civil Engineers estimates there's a $4 trillion need that if we don't address it, then over the next several years, we're probably going to see about $7 trillion in lost business sales. Between now and 2025, 2.5 million jobs lost across this country. The defining characteristic of a developed nation is the ability to deliver clean water, to treat your own sewage, to make sure you have bridges and roads that work. And also, if you spend every $1 billion you spend on infrastructure, you're able to put 15,000 people to work in construction jobs. Just as you're thinking about places and ways in which you might be able to invest or direct some of your capital, that's just a thought. I do agree that the ability to look local is something that we all need to make sure we're focusing on. I know there are some municipal governments and other local governments are looking at establishing their own funds, and others are just looking for ways to incentivize the way in which capital goes. I think there's it's so important just to be able to marry up your thoughts with whatever your local priorities are. And obviously, infrastructure, spending some time around resiliency planning as these wet weather events continue to batter the United States. Spending some time looking at issues like broadband, how we deliver solar on rooftops across public buildings, maybe across the region. In our 12 census tracts around here, we're talking about 14 public schools, Columbia College, Palmetto Health, now Prisma, the old Columbia Mall, Columbia Place Mall now, and a number of bridges, highways, and rails. And I will tell you, there's a whole lot of thinking going on around the community as to how we can come together to make sure that as this capital is deployed, that a significant amount of it is deployed right here in the Midlands of South Carolina. So I know we have some time for Q&A. I want to let you know we're deeply involved in this space and look forward to participating in dialogue as it continues. Thank you.